We had some really good questions asked at the end of the Educanon video, and so I wanted to just address these in a video because it's a lot easier to explain. So I'm going to call this our Fluency Q&A. All right, the first question comes from Carolyn, and Carolyn was a little bit confused. What exactly is Reader's Theater? So Reader's Theater is not something you do before reading or after reading. Reader's Theater is where students read a script, just like a play, but instead of memorizing their lines, they actually just read from the script. So Reader's Theater is just a chance for them to have a part, practice that part systematically, and then you get to have a performance at the end. The great thing about the performance that's different from that round robin reading where students really fear reading out loud is they've had a lot of opportunity to become fluent with their part, and they're not focused so much on what are the words on the page. They're actually focused on how can I read my words or my part as fluently as I can. So this is used typically midway through first grade when students are becoming more fluent and can decode the words. And it's used a lot in second and third grade classrooms. Right now, my daughter, who's a second grader, is using a Reader's Theater, and my daughter, who is a fifth grader, completed a Reader's Theater earlier in the year. And they're practicing their parts. Typically for a week, you can work on these parts at home as their fluency homework. You can work on them during guided reading groups and have the parts leveled. A lot of times I even had a Reader's Theater for each of my guided reading groups. So every once in a while we just chuck the books for the week, and instead we do the Reader's Theater for the week. And then at the end of the week, each group would have a chance to do their Reader's Theater for the group. Another neat thing about Reader's Theater is you can video them or invite families in to watch them. I know we'll be watching my daughter's second grade Reader's Theater. It's about Thanksgiving, and so we'll be coming in on Parent Visitation Day to see that. So it's a nice way to do a little sharing to include families, and if you video it, you can post it on your teacher blog or your teacher website or Facebook page and share that with families. That's a little bit of a motivator to students to really do a good job. The other part about Reader's Theater is, where do you come up with these Reader's Theaters? So Reader's Theater is a script. If you go online right now and you go into Pinterest or even just to Google and you Google Reader's Theaters, you'll find several out there for free that you can just print. A lot of them have to do with fairy tales or other popular stories. So teachers and publishers have taken real stories and made them into scripts. The other thing you can do, and this is something I love to do, is you can make your own scripts. So you can, let's say you read the book, I believe this week you read Muncha Muncha Muncha. You could turn that into a Reader's Theater. You could, start to pull out the different characters and what they would say and do a little mini version for your students. The neat thing was when you write your own Reader's Theater, you can have specific children in mind for the different parts, and you can read it to match their reading level. So you can take words that might be too difficult in the actual storybook, and you can bring them down to their reading level when you write the script. Another thing that I really like to do is I like to take the content area we're learning about. So whatever the focus is in social studies or science, I'd like to turn those into a script at the end of our unit as a kind of culminating activity. One of my favorite Reader's Theater scripts I wrote was about, actually I have two. One was about weather, our weather unit, and one was about habitats. And I wrote a Reader's Theater, and a lot of my science or social studies Reader's Theaters reminded me of Magic School Bus. So if you're familiar with the storyline with Miss Frizzle and they travel all over, that's how I wrote a lot of my social studies or science Reader's Theaters. And it was just reviewing vocabulary in a story format where they went off on an adventure and they encountered whatever we were learning about. So you can write your own, or you can find them out there. They're free to purchase. If you go into Teachers Pay Teachers, that website's phenomenal for getting scripts for a couple dollars, and then you can print them. So Reader's Theater is very fun. Most kiddos love it because they do have that time to practice, and they take ownership of their part, and it helps them become more fluent with their part. Thank you, Carolyn, for that question. Our next question comes from Allison. And Allison wants to know, how do you choose which fluency activities to include in your classroom? I shared with you a huge number of fluency activities through this presentation, and I know you saw a lot of those in the EduCanon video. How do you know which one to do, or should you do them all? She also asked, is it the teacher's preference or the student's preference, or both? So I'm going to throw this out here. It's pretty open-ended. When I first graduated with my undergraduate degree, I didn't even know what fluency was, and I know I've shared this, I think, within the presentation. I knew very little about how to get students to be fluent readers, and so this just gives you a lot of options. You have to find, yes, what works for you as the teacher, and also what your students enjoy. If you see an activity that you introduce to them and they just really don't like it, then bag it. There's enough other opportunities out there. What I like to do for fluency is I like to put a lot of my fluency practice in learning centers. We'd have a fluency center every week for a while. And then I can rotate through. Sometimes we've had that automated reading. Sometimes we're going to do some sort of recorded reading and working with a buddy to do some self-assessment on rubrics of how we sounded. Sometimes, if we're not in the Learning Center, we're doing small group work on fluency in a reading group. And there's things that are more conducive to being teacher-led and more independent practice. So you have to look at those activities and say, oh, this is a good one for guided reading or for a small group or even a whole group classroom lesson on fluency. And then some of those are going to be things that you would just do independently or in a learning center, or even as homework. Things like the phrasing cards or the practice where they're reading in different voices. There's a lot of opportunities for them to practice those skills with a parent volunteer or in a small group with their peers or with a partner or buddy. So really just finding what works for you and what your students respond to, because bottom line is, if they don't like it and they're not improving in their fluency, then it's not worthwhile time in the classroom. Good question, Allison. All right, our last question comes from Sarah. And Sarah has a couple questions here. The first and main question is, how do you choose the books that you use for fluency activities? She asks if they're supposed to be theme related, and she also asks if students can read their own writing to practice fluency. So there's a lot of good questions there, Sarah. First of all, not everything that you're going to do for fluency is going to be a book. So I want to throw that out there and make sure you know that. A lot of times we'll just have short passages. Also for fluency, I have a song and poetry folder, and so we're constantly reading songs and poems, and they go along with the curriculum. I know I always had math songs and poems. I always had songs for phonics, and I also had things that had to do with the months or the holidays or the time of year that we were learning about. So you don't need to just think of books when we think of fluency. The other thing for fluency is we might have phrasing cards or even just sight words. We want to be fluent with both of those. So those are other things you're going to use during these activities. Now, there will be times, though, when you want them to read in a book, and you're going to want them to be in a book that they can be a fluent reader. So if you think about this, we have three main reading levels that we put students in. We have the independent level where they can read it by themselves. We have the instructional level where they can read it with guidance, and they have the frustrational level that they're not going to be able to read on their own. Definitely cross off the frustrational level. If you want to work on fluency practice within guided reading, where you're right there with them, you could choose the instructional level, but really the best practice for fluency is giving the students something that they can read on their own. So we want to choose mainly from their independent reading level, and that means when we're choosing books, we have to know the individual student and what is their independent reading level. A lot of times for fluency practice, what teachers are doing in the classroom is they have a book bin set up that are leveled. And so they're either leveled with letters or they're leveled with numbers. And the students understand, okay, right now in guided reading, I'm reading at a level J. That means any level below J is going to be my independent level. And when it's time to practice fluency, I can go pick out a book from any level below J. The same thing is true with sending books home. A lot of times we have our students read a book a night or read for 15 minutes a night. And I usually gave the children the choice of selecting the book they wanted to take home. Sometimes they picked a book that was a little bit too hard. So they were going to work on, maybe listening comprehension that night as their parent read to them, or maybe just work on some decoding every other page. Sometimes they picked a book that was just right at their instructional level, and they might just do all the reading on that and work on comprehension and decoding. But many times, especially with my little boys, they picked books that were way too easy for them, and parents would complain and say, they can read this book in 2 seconds, they haven't memorized, this is too easy for them. And although I didn't let them choose those 2 easy books every night, those books are good too. They serve a purpose for practicing fluency. When you're familiar with a book, you can read it more fluently than a book you've never heard before. So giving students books that are considered easy for them is okay. They can work on that phrasing. They can work at looking ahead for the punctuation that's coming. They can work on that expression and the automaticity. And so all books have a purpose. Again, not just books for fluency. We have lots and lots of things we use for fluency. Songs and poems are one of my favorites, but also those phrasing PowerPoints and things. Great questions. I hope you enjoyed learning more about fluency, and I'm so happy to share this with you because it's very valuable and it's often missed in classrooms. And I know a lot of you are thinking, I want to teach preschool or younger kiddos. We can start with this kind of activity with basic sight words. So just bring it down a level and keep it simple, and you can do a lot of the activities I shared with just word cards. There we go.